Sometimes the quietest person in the room carries the loudest thunder. And when three-star athletes thought they could break the new kid's spirit in front of the entire PA class, they had no idea they were about to face a storm that would leave them trembling and begging for mercy. What happened next in that gymnasium would become the most talked about 30 seconds in Jefferson Valley High's history. And the secret this transfer student revealed would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog still clung to the mountains surrounding Jefferson Valley when Marcus Chun stepped through the doors of his 7th high school in 4 years. His father's job in military logistics meant constant relocations, and Marcus had learned to read the social landscape of a new school within minutes of arrival. The linoleum floors gleamed under fluorescent lights, and the familiar scent of industrial cleaner mixed with teenage anxiety filled his nostrils as he navigated toward the main office. Marcus was 17, lean but wiry, with black hair that fell slightly over his dark eyes, and a quiet demeanor that most people mistook for shyness. He wore simple jeans and a plain gray hoodie, nothing that would draw attention, which was exactly how he preferred it. His backpack contained the usual suspects: textbooks, notebooks, and a worn leather journal that he guarded more carefully than anything else he owned. Inside that journal were techniques, observations, and hard-won knowledge from a life that had taught him survival skills most teenagers would never need. The guidance counselor, Mrs. Peterson, was a kind woman in her 50s who handed him his schedule with a sympathetic smile. She'd seen plenty of military kids come and go, and she recognized the look in Marcus's eyes, the careful assessment, the mental mapping of exits, the invisible walls already going up. His transcript was impressive despite the constant moves. Honor roll grades, no disciplinary issues, and a curious gap where extracurricular activities should have been listed. First period was world history with Mr. Rodriguez, who introduced Marcus to the class with the standard awkward routine that made every transfer student feel like a specimen under a microscope. A few polite nods from classmates, a couple of curious glances from girls who probably found his quiet intensity intriguing, and then the blessed anonymity of taking notes while Mr. Rodriguez droned about the fall of Rome. Marcus had heard this lecture in 3 different schools already, but he listened anyway, his pen moving across paper in neat, precise handwriting that betrayed years of disciplined practice. Second period was advanced chemistry, where he quietly impressed Mrs. Kim by correctly answering a question about molecular bonding that had stumped the class. A few students looked at him with new interest, but Marcus deflected their attention by immediately returning to his notes. He'd learned that showing too much too soon could mark you as either a threat or a target, and he wasn't interested in being either. By lunch, word had already begun to spread about the new kid who kept to himself, but clearly wasn't stupid. Marcus found a corner table in the cafeteria, away from the various social clusters that dominated the space. He ate his sandwich while observing the dynamics around him, automatically cataloging the power structures, the alliances, the potential trouble spots. It was a habit ingrained by years of needing to understand his environment quickly. The football players commanded the center of the room, their letterman jackets and boisterous laughter marking their territory as clearly as wolves marking theirs. The student council kids clustered near the windows, their conversations peppered with planning committee meetings and fundraiser discussions. The theater kids occupied a corner table, animated and loud in their own way, while the various academic clubs and social groups filled in the spaces between. And then there were the ones who set Marcus's internal warning system humming. 3 junior varsity wrestlers who carried themselves with the casual arrogance of people who'd never been truly challenged. The leader was a thick-necked kid named Tyler Brennan, whose crew cut and permanent sneer suggested he'd peaked in middle school and was desperately trying to maintain his alpha status. His two lieutenants, Jake Morrison and Connor Walsh, flanked him like faithful guard dogs, laughing too loudly at his jokes and scanning the room for opportunities to prove their loyalty. Marcus had encountered their type in every school, kids who mistook size for strength, popularity for power, and cruelty for courage. They were predators, but lazy ones, preferring easy targets and public displays that fed their egos while establishing their dominance. He made a mental note to avoid them, finished his lunch, and headed to his afternoon classes with the hope that he could maintain his low profile until the inevitable next move. Fourth period was English literature with Miss Harrison, a passionate teacher who had the rare gift of making Shakespeare accessible to teenagers. Marcus found himself genuinely engaged for the first time that day as they discussed the themes of power and corruption in Macbeth. When Miss Harrison asked for examples of how ambition could lead to downfall, Marcus raised his hand and offered a thoughtful analysis that connected the play to modern political situations. Several classmates looked impressed, and even Miss Harrison seemed pleased to have a student who could think beyond the surface level. That small moment of participation would later seem like a crucial mistake. Fifth period was study hall, which Marcus spent in the library, working ahead on assignments and reading a biography of Sun Tzu that he'd checked out. The Art of War wasn't typical reading for a high school student, but Marcus had developed an interest in strategic thinking during his many relocations. He found comfort in the ancient general's teachings about knowing yourself and your enemy, about choosing your battles wisely, and about the importance of preparation. As he read, Marcus became aware of a commotion near the computer stations. A freshman girl was being harassed by two older students, who were mocking her appearance and threatening to post embarrassing photos of her online. The librarian was nowhere to be seen, and the other students in the area were pointedly ignoring the situation. Marcus watched for a moment, his jaw tightening as the girl's distress became more apparent. Every instinct told him to stay out of it, to maintain his invisibility and avoid drawing attention. But as the harassment escalated and the girl began to cry, Marcus closed his book and walked over to the computer station. He didn't say anything dramatic or threatening. He simply stood beside the girl and fixed the two bullies with a steady stare that somehow conveyed more menace than any words could have. The bullies were smaller than him, probably sophomores trying to establish their own pecking order by picking on someone even more vulnerable. They took one look at Marcus's calm, unwavering gaze and seemed to realize they'd stumbled into deeper waters than they'd intended. After a moment of uncomfortable silence, they muttered something about it being a joke and slunk away to find easier prey. The freshman girl, whose name was Amy, thanked Marcus quietly before gathering her things and leaving. Marcus returned to his table and his book, but the interaction had been observed by several other students. Word began to spread about the new kid who'd faced down two bullies without saying a word, and by the end of the period, Marcus realized his carefully maintained low profile had just taken a significant hit. The final bell rang, and Marcus headed to his locker to collect his things before the bus ride to his new temporary home. But as he walked down the hallway, he noticed more students looking at him than before. Some seemed approving, others curious, but a few wore expressions that suggested trouble was brewing. He'd upset the established order by interfering with the natural predator-prey relationship, and that rarely went unnoticed by the apex predators. As he reached his locker, Marcus found Tyler Brennan leaning against the adjacent lockers, with Jake and Connor flanking him in a casual formation that blocked the hallway traffic. Other students gave them a wide berth, their body language telegraphing the kind of respect born from fear rather than admiration. Tyler was bigger than Marcus had initially assessed, probably 6'2" and thick through the chest and shoulders. His hands were scarred from wrestling practice, and his eyes held the flat, calculating look of someone who enjoyed inflicting pain. Jake was smaller but more wiry, with quick, nervous energy that suggested he might be the most dangerous of the three when cornered. Connor was the muscle, broad and slow-moving, but with the kind of mass that could cause serious damage if properly directed. "Heard you played hero in the library today," Tyler said, his voice carrying just loud enough for nearby students to hear. It wasn't a question, and his tone suggested this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. Marcus opened his locker and began collecting his books, not acknowledging the comment. He'd learned that engaging with bullies often escalated situations unnecessarily, and he still hoped to defuse this before it went too far. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Tyler continued, stepping closer. "You got a problem with how things work around here?" Marcus closed his locker and turned to face the three wrestlers. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He was outnumbered and outweighed, but his posture remained relaxed, his hands visible and non-threatening. Years of moving from school to school had taught him to read these situations carefully, to understand when words might still work and when action became inevitable. "No problem," Marcus said quietly. "Just trying to get to my bus." Tyler's sneer widened. "See, that's where you're wrong, transfer boy. You made it my problem when you stuck your nose where it doesn't belong. Amy Chun's fair game around here. And we don't need some army brat deciding what's right and wrong." The mention of Amy's last name made Marcus pause. Chun. She might be related to him somehow. Or Tyler might just be using the coincidence to needle him. Either way, the casual dismissal of a younger student as fair game confirmed everything Marcus had suspected about these three. "I wasn't making any decisions," Marcus replied evenly. "Just standing there." Jake snickered. "Yeah, right. Like, you didn't know exactly what you were doing. Trying to look tough for the little freshman." A small crowd was beginning to gather, drawn by the tension and the promise of entertainment. Marcus could see teachers beginning to notice the commotion. But they were still too far away to intervene quickly. He had maybe 30 seconds before this situation either resolved itself or exploded into something much worse. "Look," Marcus said, keeping his voice calm and reasonable. "I'm not looking for trouble. I'm just trying to finish my first day without any drama." Connor laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the lockers. "Too late for that, army boy. You already made your choice when you decided to play White Knight." Tyler stepped even closer, close enough that Marcus could smell the protein powder on his breath and see the acne scars on his neck. "Here's how this works, transfer. Tomorrow's P class, you're going to learn about respect. We're going to have a little wrestling demonstration. Show everyone what happens when new kids forget their place." The threat was clear, and Marcus felt the familiar cold calculation settling over him. He'd been in this exact situation before. In different schools with different bullies, but the dynamic was always the same. They'd cornered him in a public space, made their intentions clear, and now expected him to either submit or escalate. What they didn't understand was that Marcus had been preparing for moments like this his entire life. "Pay's not until Friday," Marcus said, his voice still calm but with an edge that hadn't been there before. Tyler's grin turned predatory. "That's right. Gives you all of tomorrow to think about what's coming. Maybe you'll decide to transfer schools again before then. Save everyone some trouble." The crowd was larger now. Phones were coming out, and Marcus could see teachers pushing through. The students to break up whatever was happening. He had seconds to make a choice that would define his entire experience at Jefferson Valley High. He could back down, apologize, maybe even take Tyler's suggestion and convince his father to request another transfer. It would be the safe choice. The smart choice, the choice that avoided unnecessary conflict. But as Marcus looked at the eager faces of the three wrestlers, at the crowd hoping for a show, at the younger students watching to see if their potential protector would crumble, under pressure, he made a different decision entirely. "I'll see you in pay," Marcus said quietly, and there was something in his tone that made Tyler's confident smirk falter for just a moment. Before anyone could respond, Mr. Peterson, the vice principal, pushed through the crowd with the authority of someone used to breaking up teenage confrontations. "What's going on here? Everyone disperse. Buses are loading." The crowd began to scatter reluctantly, disappointed that the drama had been interrupted before it could reach its climax. Tyler, Jake, and Connor stepped back, but Tyler made sure to catch Marcus's eye one more time. "Friday," he mouthed silently, and then all three wrestlers walked away with the casual confidence of people who'd never lost a fight that mattered. Marcus shouldered his backpack and headed for the bus, his mind already working through the implications of what had just happened. He'd managed to avoid serious conflict on his first day, but he'd also painted a target on his back that would be impossible to erase. Tomorrow would be about preparation, and Friday would be about consequences. As the bus pulled away from Jefferson Valley High, Marcus stared out the window at the mountains rising around the valley and thought about Sun Tzu's teachings on the importance of choosing the right ground for battle. Tyler Brennan thought he'd cornered a helpless transfer student, but he had no idea what kind of storm he'd just invited into his carefully controlled world. The next morning arrived gray and cold, with frost covering the windows of Marcus's temporary home in base housing. His father had already left for his shift at the logistics center, leaving behind a note about dinner plans and a reminder to call if there were any problems at school. Colonel Chun believed in letting his son handle his own conflicts when possible, a philosophy born from years of military service and an understanding that resilience came from facing challenges rather than avoiding them. Marcus ate breakfast in silence, reviewing his mental preparation for the day ahead. He'd spent the previous evening researching Jefferson Valley High's wrestling program, learning about their recent record, their coaching staff, and most importantly, their star wrestlers. Tyler Brennan was good, but not exceptional. He'd placed third in the regional championships the previous year, losing in the semifinals to a wrestler from a larger school. Jake Morrison was smaller but more technically skilled, while Connor Walsh relied primarily on strength and aggression. What concerned Marcus more than their athletic abilities was their reputation for cruelty. A little online research had revealed several incidents over the past 2 years: a freshman who'd been hospitalized after a hazing incident, a transfer student who'd left school after mysterious injuries, and a pattern of intimidation that the school administration seemed either unable or unwilling to address effectively. As Marcus walked through the school's front doors for his second day, he noticed the difference immediately. Students looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and anticipation that hadn't been there before. Word had spread about yesterday's confrontation, and everyone was waiting to see what would happen when the new kid faced the wrestlers in pay class. First period world history passed without incident, though Marcus noticed Tyler sitting 3 rows ahead of him, occasionally turning to stare with undisguised malice. Second period chemistry was equally quiet, but the tension was building like pressure in a sealed container. By lunch, the entire school seemed to know about Friday's impending confrontation. Marcus ate alone again, but this time several students approached his table. A group of theater kids offered their support, sharing stories of their own encounters with Tyler's crew. 2 members of the debate team suggested he report the incident to the administration, though their lack of conviction suggested they knew how ineffective that approach would be. Even a few football players stopped by, not to offer help, but to size him up, curious about the new kid who'd challenged the wrestler's authority. "You don't have to do this, you know," said a quiet voice behind him. Marcus turned to see Amy, the freshman he'd helped in the library. She was small and slight, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and an expression of genuine concern. "Do what?" Marcus asked, though he knew exactly what she meant. "Face them on Friday. Everyone's talking about it, but you could just not show up, claim you're sick or something. Maybe they'll lose interest and move on to someone else." Marcus studied her face, seeing his own younger self in her careful hopefulness. And what happens to the next person they decide to target? Or the one after that? Amy's shoulders sagged slightly. I don't know. But what happens to you if you go through with this? Tyler's never lost a wrestling match against another student. Jake's almost as good, and Connor doesn't care about rules. Thanks for the warning, Marcus said gently. But I think I'll be okay. Amy looked like she wanted to say more, but the lunch bell rang and students began filtering toward their afternoon classes. As she gathered her things, she paused and looked back at Marcus with an expression of desperate hope, mixed with terrible fear. My older brother went to school here 3 years ago, she said quietly. He tried to stand up to them too. He ended up in the hospital with a concussion and 2 broken ribs. The administration called it a wrestling accident. Marcus felt a cold anger settling in his chest, but his voice remained calm. What happened to your brother after that? He transferred schools. We moved to a different district so he could finish his senior year somewhere safe. Amy's voice was barely above a whisper. I'm stuck here for 3 more years. As Amy walked away, Marcus understood that Friday's confrontation was about more than just his own safety or dignity. It was about every student who'd been terrorized by Tyler's crew, every kid who'd transferred schools or suffered in silence, every person who'd watched cruelty triumph because no one was willing to fight back. The afternoon classes passed in, a haze of anticipation and planning. Marcus found himself thinking about his father's stories of military operations, about the importance of intelligence gathering, preparation, and understanding your opponent's weaknesses. Tyler Brennan might be a skilled wrestler, but he was also overconfident, used to facing opponents who were already beaten before the match began. After school, instead of heading straight to the bus, Marcus made his way to the gymnasium. It was mostly empty, with just a few students shooting basketballs and the maintenance crew setting up equipment for the next day. He walked the perimeter of the wrestling mats, noting the layout, the lighting, the exits, and most importantly, the sight lines from the bleachers where students and teachers would be watching. Scoping out your funeral? A voice called from the entrance. Marcus turned to see Tyler Brennan entering the gym with Jake and Connor, all 3 dressed in their wrestling practice gear. They'd obviously been training, preparing for Friday's demonstration, and their confidence radiated from every movement. Just familiarizing myself with the space, Marcus replied evenly. Tyler laughed, but there was less humor in it than there had been the day before. Something about Marcus's calm demeanor seemed to unsettle him, as if he'd expected fear or defiance but was getting neither. You know, transfer, you could still back out. Tell everyone you got sick or your daddy got transferred again. No shame in recognizing when you're outmatched. Marcus stepped onto the wrestling mat, feeling the give of the surface beneath his feet. Is that what you told the other kids you hospitalized? That there was no shame in backing down? Tyler's expression darkened, and Jake and Connor moved to flank him instinctively. The casual atmosphere evaporated, replaced by something much more dangerous. Those were accidents, Tyler said, but his voice lacked conviction. Things happen in wrestling. It's a contact sport. Right, Marcus said, stepping back off the mat. Accidents. He walked toward the exit, but Tyler's voice stopped him. Tomorrow transfer, in front of everyone. We're going to teach you about respect the hard way. Marcus paused in the doorway without turning around. I'm looking forward to it. As he left the gymnasium, Marcus could feel the 3 wrestlers staring at his back, probably trying to figure out why their intimidation tactics weren't working. What they didn't understand was that Marcus had been intimidated by experts, by people whose threats carried the weight of real consequence. High school bullies, no matter how physically gifted, simply didn't register on the same scale. That evening, Marcus sat in his room with his leather journal open before him, reviewing techniques and strategies he'd learned over the years. His father had insisted on self-defense training from an early age, both formal martial arts and the More practical skills taught by military instructors who understood real-world violence. Marcus had also learned from experience, from confrontations in other schools, that had taught him hard lessons about timing, leverage, and the psychology of combat. But more than physical techniques, Marcus had learned something else from his nomadic childhood: the power of reputation. Every school had its own ecosystem, its own power structure, and sometimes the only way to find your place in that structure was to demonstrate that you wouldn't be pushed around. Tomorrow's confrontation wasn't really about wrestling or fighting. It was about establishing who he was and what he would and wouldn't tolerate. As he prepared for bed, Marcus thought about Amy's brother, about all the other students who'd been broken by Tyler's crew, and about the choice he'd made to stand and fight rather than run. He'd been running from confrontations his entire life, moving from school to school, always the outsider, always the target. Tomorrow, for better or worse, the running would stop. Friday morning dawned clear and cold, with winter's sunlight streaming through the classroom windows and casting long shadows across the hallways. Marcus arrived at school to find the atmosphere electric with anticipation. Students who normally paid no attention to P class were asking about schedules, trying to figure out when the confrontation would happen and how they could witness it. The morning classes passed in a blur of nervous energy and whispered conversations. Teachers seemed to sense something was building but couldn't quite put their finger on what. Marcus maintained his usual quiet demeanor, but there was something different about him that morning, a stillness that suggested coiled energy waiting for release. At lunch, the cafeteria was buzzing with rumors and speculation. Some students claimed Tyler had been bragging about what he was going to do to the transfer student. Others whispered that Marcus had been seen practicing martial arts behind the school building, though that rumor was completely false. The truth was simpler and more complex than any of the stories. Marcus was ready. As the final bell rang, students headed to their last period classes. Marcus made his way toward the gymnasium with the measured pace of someone walking toward his destiny. Pay class was about to begin, and with it, the confrontation that would define his place at Jefferson Valley High School forever. The gymnasium doors swung open with a metallic groan that seemed to echo through the entire building. Marcus stepped inside to find the space already buzzing with anticipation. Word had spread faster than wildfire through Jefferson Valley High's social networks, and what should have been a routine P class had transformed into the school's most anticipated event of the semester. Coach Williams stood near his office door, clipboard in hand, surveying the unusual crowd that had gathered. Normally, P classes attracted only the required participants and maybe a few friends with study hall periods. Today, the bleachers were filling with students who had no business being there, their phones already out and recording despite the school's official policy against filming during class time. The wrestling mats had been laid out in the center of the gymnasium floor, their blue surface gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. The regulation wrestling circle seemed smaller than Marcus remembered from his reconnaissance the day before, more intimate and unforgiving. There would be nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, just 30 feet of padded surface where reputations would be made or destroyed. Tyler Brennan was already warming up near the far wall, going through a series of stretches and practice moves that showcased his muscular frame and technical skill. He'd changed into his varsity wrestling singlet, the school colors of navy and gold making him look official and intimidating. Jake Morrison and Connor Walsh flanked him like loyal seconds, offering encouragement and occasionally glancing toward the entrance to track Marcus's arrival. The crowd fell silent as Marcus walked across the gymnasium floor toward the locker room. Every step seemed amplified in the sudden quiet, and he could feel dozens of pairs of eyes tracking his movement. Some faces showed concern, others excitement, but most displayed the morbid curiosity that drew people to car accidents and disaster scenes. In the locker room, Marcus changed into his standard pay uniform, gray shorts and a plain white t-shirt. That revealed arms more muscled than his usual long sleeves suggested. Years of military-approved fitness routines had given him a lean but powerful build, all functional strength with no wasted bulk. He tied his shoes with precise movements, checked that his joints were loose and ready, and took a moment to center himself mentally. The breathing techniques his father had taught him kicked in automatically. 4 counts in, hold for 4, 4 counts out. The familiar rhythm slowed his heart rate and sharpened his focus, transforming nervous energy into cold calculation. Marcus had been in fights before, both formal and informal, but never with so much riding on the outcome. This wasn't just about personal safety anymore. It was about establishing whether Jefferson Valley High would be another school where he suffered in silence or the place where he finally drew a line in the sand. When Marcus emerged from the locker room, the crowd had grown even larger. Students who should have been in other classes had somehow found excuses to be present, and even a few teachers lurked near the gymnasium entrance, drawn by the electric tension that filled the air. Coach Williams looked increasingly uncomfortable with the situation, but seemed unsure how to disperse the crowd without acknowledging that something unusual was happening. Tyler had finished his warm-up and now stood in the center of the wrestling mat, hands on his hips, radiating confidence. His technical skills were immediately apparent in the way he moved, the unconscious balance and spatial awareness that came from years of training. But there was something else in his posture, a cruel anticipation that suggested he was looking forward to more than just a wrestling demonstration. "Gentlemen," Coach Williams called out, his voice carrying across the gymnasium, "this is supposed to be a learning exercise. Basic wrestling techniques, nothing more. I want clean competition and good sportsmanship." Tyler nodded respectfully, but his eyes never left Marcus. "Of course, Coach. Just showing the new student how we do things here at Jefferson Valley." Marcus stepped onto the mat, feeling the give of the padded surface beneath his feet. The material was designed to prevent injuries during legitimate wrestling matches, but he suspected Tyler wasn't planning to limit himself to regulation techniques. The crowd leaned forward expectantly, phones held high despite Coach Williams's disapproving glare. "Basic rules," the coach continued, though his voice lacked conviction. "No striking, no dangerous holds, tap out when you're beaten. This is about technique, not brutality." Both wrestlers nodded their agreement, but Marcus could see the predatory gleam in Tyler's eyes. The bigger boy was already calculating his first move, probably planning to use his size advantage to overwhelm Marcus quickly and decisively. What Tyler didn't know was that Marcus had been analyzing him for days, studying his movements, his preferences, his weaknesses. The two circled each other slowly, hands raised in the classic wrestling stance. Tyler was bigger and stronger, with longer reach and more formal training. But Marcus had advantages of his own: speed, flexibility, and most importantly, experience with real violence rather than just athletic competition. Military training emphasized effectiveness over style, and Marcus had learned techniques that would never be taught in a high school wrestling program. Tyler made the first move, lunging forward with a textbook double-leg takedown attempt. It was fast and technically sound, the kind of move that had probably worked against dozens of other high school opponents. Marcus sidestepped smoothly, using Tyler's momentum against him and applying a subtle hip check that sent the bigger boy stumbling past his target. The crowd murmured with surprise. They'd expected Marcus to be overwhelmed immediately, but instead he'd made Tyler look clumsy and overconfident. Tyler's face flushed with embarrassment and anger as he regained his balance, his casual arrogance beginning to crack. "Lucky move, transfer," Tyler growled, resetting his stance. "Won't happen again." This time Tyler approached more cautiously, using his reach advantage to probe for openings. He shot in for Marcus's legs again, but when Marcus moved to counter, Tyler adapted quickly, switching to an upper body attack that caught Marcus off guard. Strong arms wrapped around Marcus's torso, and suddenly he was fighting against Tyler's superior leverage and weight. For a moment, it looked like the confrontation would end quickly. Tyler lifted Marcus off his feet, preparing to slam him down onto the mat with enough force to drive the air from his lungs and establish dominance. The crowd held its breath, and Marcus could see the triumph already forming in Tyler's eyes. But Marcus had been in this position before, in training sessions with military instructors who didn't believe in going easy on students. Instead of fighting against Tyler's strength, he relaxed into the hold, lowering his center of gravity and creating an unexpected shift in balance. When Tyler tried to complete the takedown, Marcus hooked his leg behind Tyler's knee and twisted sharply. Both wrestlers went down, but not the way Tyler had planned. Instead of landing on top in a dominant position, he found himself tangled, with Marcus in a scramble where technique mattered more than raw strength. Marcus's hands moved with precision born from countless hours of practice, finding leverage points and pressure spots that most high school wrestlers had never encountered. Within seconds, Marcus had escaped Tyler's hold and reversed their positions. Now he was on top, controlling Tyler's movement with grips that felt deceptively light, but were impossible to break. Tyler struggled frantically, his face reddening with effort and embarrassment, but Marcus's positioning was perfect. "What the hell?" Tyler gasped, trying to bridge out of the hold. "How are you doing this?" Marcus didn't answer. His focus was complete, his movements economical and purposeful. He wasn't trying to hurt Tyler, just control him, but the psychological impact was devastating. The star wrestler was being dominated by a transfer student who'd never set foot on Jefferson Valley's mats before. The crowd was silent now, mesmerized by the technical display. Even Coach Williams found himself leaning forward, studying Marcus's technique with professional interest. These weren't moves from any high school wrestling manual. They were something else entirely, more sophisticated and practical than anything taught in civilian programs. Tyler made a desperate attempt to escape, using a burst of strength to create space between them. For a moment, it worked, and he managed to scramble back to his feet. But Marcus rose smoothly beside him, never losing his balance or his tactical advantage. They circled again, but now the dynamic had completely shifted. "This isn't possible," Jake Morrison muttered from the sidelines, his confidence in his leader beginning to waver. Tyler's breathing was already labored, more from stress than physical exertion. He'd expected to dominate this confrontation from the first second, to establish his superiority so quickly and decisively that Marcus would never consider challenging him again. Instead, he found himself facing an opponent who seemed to anticipate his every move, who countered his techniques with variations he'd never seen before. The second exchange was even more one-sided. Tyler attempted a single-leg takedown, driving forward with all his strength and determination. Marcus allowed him to initiate the attack, then used Tyler's momentum to execute a perfect sprawl that left the bigger boy face down on the mat with Marcus controlling his back. From there, Marcus demonstrated a level of technical mastery that left the crowd stunned. He transitioned smoothly between control positions, never allowing Tyler to escape, but never applying enough pressure to cause real injury. It was like watching a chess master play against a novice, each move calculated and purposeful. Tyler's frustration boiled over into desperation. When Marcus allowed him to return to his feet, Tyler abandoned all pretense of following wrestling rules. He threw a wild punch that would have been illegal in any legitimate competition, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. Marcus ducked the punch easily, his reaction time suggesting he'd been expecting exactly this development. As Tyler's fist sailed over his head, Marcus grabbed the extended arm and used Tyler's own momentum to execute a textbook arm drag that sent the bigger boy sprawling across the mat. "That's enough!" Coach Williams finally found his voice, stepping onto the mat with his whistle raised. "Tyler, that was completely out of line. This demonstration is over." But Tyler wasn't finished. His reputation was crumbling before his eyes, his carefully constructed image of dominance being destroyed by a quiet transfer student who wasn't even breathing hard. As he climbed to his feet, his face was a mask of humiliated rage. "This isn't over, transfer," he snarled, loud enough for the entire crowd to hear. "You want to embarrass me in front of everyone? Fine, but you better watch your back, because I'm going to make your life hell." The threat hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Everyone present understood that Tyler was no longer talking about wrestling or athletic competition. This had become personal, and his promise of retaliation carried the weight of 3 years of unopposed cruelty. Marcus stood calmly in the center of the mat, his expression unchanged. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly through the silent gymnasium. "You already tried to make my life hell," he said. "How did that work out for you?" The words hit Tyler like a physical blow. Around the gymnasium, students began to realize what they'd just witnessed. The school's most feared bully had been completely outclassed, not through luck or accident, but through superior skill and preparation. The transfer student they'd expected to see destroyed had instead dismantled Tyler's reputation with surgical precision. Jake Morrison and Connor Walsh moved to flank their leader, their own confidence shaken, but their loyalty intact. The 3 wrestlers formed a tight group near the edge of the mat, whispering urgently among themselves. Whatever they were planning, it wasn't going to be limited to official school hours or supervised activities. Amy appeared at the edge of the crowd, her face pale with concern. She'd seen what happened to her brother after he'd challenged Tyler's crew, and she could read the dangerous shift in the 3 wrestlers' body language. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Coach Williams was trying to restore order, dismissing the crowd and ending the impromptu demonstration. But damage had been done that couldn't be undone with whistles and official authority. The social hierarchy of Jefferson Valley High had been shaken to its foundation, and everyone present understood that the consequences would ripple through the school for weeks to come. As students began filing out of the gymnasium, many stopped to look at Marcus with new respect. Others seemed nervous, worried about what Tyler's retaliation might mean for anyone associated with the transfer student. A few simply stared, trying to process what they'd witnessed and figure out how it would change their own positions in the school's complex social ecosystem. Marcus walked toward the locker room with the same measured pace he'd maintained throughout the confrontation. His breathing was steady, his movements controlled, but there was something different about him now. The quiet transfer student who'd been trying to maintain a low profile was gone, replaced by someone who'd revealed glimpses of capabilities that extended far beyond high school athletics. In the locker room, Marcus changed back into his regular clothes while processing what had just happened. He'd accomplished his immediate goal of preventing Tyler from humiliating him publicly, but he'd also escalated the conflict to a level that would be difficult to contain. Tyler's threat of retaliation wasn't idle. It was a promise backed by 3 years of successful intimidation and a network of allies who wouldn't hesitate to help him restore his damaged reputation. As Marcus gathered his belongings, he became aware that he wasn't alone in the locker room. Connor Walsh stood near the entrance, his bulk blocking the only exit. The largest of Tyler's crew hadn't said much during the confrontation, but his presence now carried a clear message. "That was a nice show out there," Connor said, his voice deceptively casual. "Real impressive. But you made a mistake, transfer." Marcus finished packing his bag and turned to face Connor directly. The bigger boy was trying to use his size to intimidate, positioning himself to make Marcus feel trapped and vulnerable. It was a classic technique, but one that required the target to be afraid of physical confrontation. "What mistake was that?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious about Connor's perspective. You embarrassed Tyler in front of everyone, made him look weak. You think that's just going to blow over? You think he's going to let you walk around this school like some kind of hero?" Marcus considered the question seriously. He'd known that defeating Tyler publicly would have consequences, but he'd also understood that allowing himself to be humiliated would have been worse. Once Bullies established dominance over a target, that relationship rarely changed without external intervention. "I think Tyler had a choice," Marcus replied. "He could have left me alone and none of this would have happened. He decided to make it a public confrontation, and he lost. That's on him, not me." Connor's face darkened. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't about fair or unfair. This is about respect. Tyler's been running this school for 3 years, and you just waltzed in here and made him look like an amateur. You think the other kids are going to respect that? You think they're going to follow you instead of him?" Marcus moved closer to Connor, close enough to see the uncertainty flickering behind the bigger boy's aggressive facade. "I'm not asking anyone to follow me. I just want to be left alone." "Too late for that," Connor said, but his voice lacked conviction. He'd seen what Marcus had done to Tyler, and despite his size advantage, he wasn't eager to test his own skills against the transfer student. Marcus walked toward the exit, and after a moment of tense silence, Connor stepped aside. As Marcus passed, Connor's voice followed him. "This isn't over transfer. Tyler's got friends you haven't met yet, and some of them don't care about rules or witnesses." Marcus paused in the doorway without turning around. "Tell Tyler I'll be ready." The rest of the school day passed in a haze of whispered conversations and sideways glances. Marcus's demonstration in the gymnasium had become the only topic of conversation, with details being embellished and distorted with each retelling. By the final bell, some versions of the story had Marcus throwing Tyler across the room, while others claimed he'd used illegal martial arts techniques that should have resulted in immediate suspension. The truth was more complex and ultimately more impressive than any of the exaggerated versions. Marcus had simply outclassed Tyler through superior preparation, better technique, and the kind of mental discipline that came from facing real adversity. He hadn't needed to break any rules or use excessive force. He'd just been better. As students filed toward the buses and parking lots, Marcus found himself walking alongside Amy, who'd been waiting near his locker. Her expression was a mixture of admiration and deep concern. "That was incredible," she said quietly. "I've never seen anyone handle Tyler like that." He looked completely helpless. Marcus nodded acknowledgement, but didn't seem particularly pleased with the praise. "Your brother was right to transfer schools. This isn't going to end here." Amy's face fell. "I know. Connor and Jake were talking to some of the football players during last period. And Tyler looked like he wanted to kill someone. You really think they're going to come after you outside of school?" "Probably," Marcus said matter-of-factly. "Bullies don't usually accept defeat gracefully. They'll want to restore their reputation, and the only way to do that is to prove that what happened today was a fluke." They walked in silence for a moment, both understanding the implications of what Marcus had started. The demonstration in the gymnasium had been a tactical victory, but it had also declared a war that Marcus would have to fight largely alone. "Why did you do it?" Amy asked suddenly. "You could have avoided all of this. You could have transferred schools or just kept your head down until graduation. Why take the risk?" Marcus considered the question as they approached the bus loading area. Around them, other students were clustering in small groups, their conversations dominated by speculation about what would happen next. Some seemed excited by the drama, others worried about the potential for violence, but all of them understood that the social landscape of Jefferson Valley High had been permanently altered. "Because someone had to," Marcus said finally. "Tyler and his friends have been terrorizing kids like you for years, and everyone just accepts it as normal. Your brother shouldn't have had to change schools. You shouldn't have to spend the next 3 years looking over your shoulder. Sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to prove they're not as tough as they pretend to be. Amy smiled sadly. My brother said the same thing before they put him in the hospital. Being right doesn't make you bulletproof. Marcus boarded his bus, leaving Amy standing on the sidewalk with an expression of mixed hope and terror. As the bus pulled away from Jefferson Valley High, he could see Tyler's crew gathered near the student parking lot, their body language suggesting intense planning and preparation. Whatever they were discussing, it wasn't going to be limited to school grounds or supervised activities. The bus ride home gave Marcus time to think about his next moves. He'd won the first battle, but the war was just beginning. Tyler's threat of retaliation wasn't idle, and Marcus knew from experience that cornered bullies often escalated to levels of violence that shocked even their victims. He would need to be prepared for anything, from social ostracism to physical assault to attempts to get him expelled or arrested on false charges. But as the bus wound through the mountain roads toward base housing, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging to his own choices, rather than being swept along by circumstances beyond his control. For once, he hadn't run from a confrontation or tried to make himself invisible. He'd stood his ground and proven that bullies weren't invincible, that their power came from the fear and compliance of their victims, rather than any inherent superiority. The real test would come in the days and weeks ahead, when Tyler and his allies had time to plan their response and marshal their resources. Marcus had no illusions about the challenges he would face, but he also had advantages that Tyler couldn't. Understand or counter, discipline, preparation, and the kind of determination that came from finally deciding to stop running from fights he hadn't started. As the bus pulled into the base housing complex, Marcus could see his father's car in the driveway. Colonel Chun would want to hear about his son's day, and Marcus found himself looking forward to that conversation. For the first time in years, he had something to report that didn't involve compromise, avoidance, or quiet surrender to forces beyond his control. Monday morning arrived with an ominous stillness that settled over Jefferson Valley High like the calm before a hurricane. Marcus noticed the difference immediately as he walked through the front entrance. Students who had previously ignored him now watched his every movement, some with admiration, others with barely concealed fear about what his presence might bring down on their heads. The weekend had given Tyler and his crew time to plan, and the results were already visible. Jake Morrison stood near Marcus's locker, not blocking it but close enough to send a message. Connor Walsh lurked by the water fountains, his massive frame impossible to miss. Tyler himself was nowhere to be seen, but his absence felt more threatening than his presence would have. Marcus approached his locker with the same measured calm he'd maintained since Friday's confrontation. Jake stepped aside without a word, but his eyes tracked every movement as Marcus gathered his books for first period. The message was clear. They were watching, waiting, looking for the right moment to restore their damaged reputation. In world history, Mr. Rodriguez seemed oblivious to the tension that filled the classroom whenever Tyler and Marcus were in the same space. Tyler sat 3 rows ahead, his shoulders rigid with barely controlled anger. He hadn't spoken to Marcus directly since Friday, but his presence radiated hostility like heat from a furnace. The morning passed without incident, but Marcus could feel the pressure building with each class period. Students whispered in hallways, teachers cast worried glances at known troublemakers, and the administration had clearly been briefed about potential problems. Vice Principal Peterson made conspicuous appearances wherever crowds gathered, his presence both reassuring and ominous. Lunch period brought the first real test. Marcus entered the cafeteria to find Tyler's crew occupying their usual table, but now they were surrounded by reinforcements. Several football players had joined them, along with a few older students whose graduation had apparently been delayed by academic difficulties. The alliance represented a significant escalation in the conflict. Amy found Marcus at his corner table, her face pale with worry. "They've been recruiting all morning," she whispered urgently. "Derek Santos from the football team, Mike Chun from Auto Shop, even some kids from Riverside High. Tyler's telling everyone you used illegal moves, that you cheated somehow." Marcus continued eating his sandwich, but his eyes swept the cafeteria systematically. The gathering at Tyler's table wasn't random. These were students with reputations for violence, kids who'd been suspended for fighting, young men who saw conflict as entertainment rather than consequence. "There's something else," Amy continued, her voice dropping even lower. "Jake was bragging about having a plan for after school. Something about the old quarry road where there wouldn't be any witnesses or cameras." The quarry road was an isolated stretch of gravel that wound through the mountains above town, popular with teenagers for parties and activities they didn't want adult supervision observing. It was also the perfect location for the kind of confrontation that could escalate beyond typical high school drama. Marcus finished his lunch in silence while considering his options. He could avoid the confrontation by staying on school grounds until his father picked him up, but that would only delay the inevitable. Tyler's enlarged crew wouldn't simply lose interest and move on to other targets. They would interpret avoidance as weakness and press their advantage until Marcus was forced to either fight or flee the school entirely. The afternoon classes passed in a haze of anticipation and planning. Word had spread about the after-school gathering at Quarry Road, and students were already choosing sides or making excuses to be elsewhere. Teachers seemed to sense the building tension, but couldn't identify its source clearly enough to intervene. Effectively, as the final bell rang, Marcus made his decision. Instead of heading toward the buses, he walked to the student parking lot where Tyler's expanded crew was waiting. The group had grown to nearly a dozen students, all of them older and larger than typical high school wrestlers. This wasn't going to be about athletic competition or technical skill. It was about raw intimidation and the kind of violence that left lasting damage. Tyler stood at the center of the group, his confidence restored by the presence of his allies. When he saw Marcus approaching, his face split into a cruel smile that promised retribution for Friday's humiliation. "Look who decided to show up," Tyler called out, loud enough for the gathering crowd of spectators to hear. "Thought you might chicken out and call Daddy for a ride home." Marcus stopped just outside the group's perimeter, his hands visible and relaxed. He'd learned long ago that appearing non-threatening often provided tactical advantages in confrontations with multiple opponents. "You wanted to talk," Marcus said simply. "Here I am." Derek Santos, a linebacker whose size made even Connor look small, stepped forward with the swagger of someone accustomed to physical dominance. "This ain't about talking, transfer. This is about teaching you some respect." The circle began closing around Marcus, a classic intimidation technique designed to make the target feel trapped and helpless. But instead of backing away or showing fear, Marcus did something unexpected. He smiled. 12 against 1, he observed quietly. "That seems about right for your skill level." The insult hit home, and several members of the group bristled with anger. Tyler's face flushed red, but he held up a hand to stop his allies from attacking immediately. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Tyler snarled. "Think you're better than us because you got lucky on Friday? Let's see how smart you are when there's no referee to save you." Marcus's response was so quiet that the crowd had to strain to hear it, but his words carried clearly in the afternoon stillness. "I don't need a referee." What happened next would be talked about at Jefferson Valley High for years to come. Instead of waiting for the group to attack him, Marcus moved first, but not in the direction anyone expected. Rather than trying to fight his way out of the circle, he stepped directly toward Derek Santos, the largest and most intimidating member of Tyler's crew. Derek had been expecting pleading or desperate attempts to escape, not a direct confrontation. His reflexes were good for football, but inadequate for the kind of close-quarters combat that Marcus initiated. Before Derek could react, Marcus had slipped inside his reach and applied a precisely targeted pressure point technique that sent the massive linebacker crashing to his knees with a gasp of shocked pain. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Derek Santos was known throughout the school as an unstoppable force, someone who'd never lost a fight or backed down from a challenge. Watching him crumple from a single touch destroyed the group's confidence more effectively than any speech or threat could have. Marcus stepped back from Derek's writhing form and addressed the remaining members of Tyler's crew with the same calm voice he'd maintained throughout the confrontation. "Anyone else want to test their luck?" The circle began dissolving as students backed away from the quiet transfer student who just neutralized their most dangerous ally without breaking a sweat. Mike Chun muttered something about having to get to work and disappeared toward the parking lot. Two of the Riverside High students exchanged glances and followed him, their enthusiasm for violence evaporating in the face of Marcus's demonstrated capabilities. Tyler found himself standing alone with Jake and Connor, his carefully assembled army abandoning him when their own safety became questionable. His face cycled through a range of emotions: shock, fear, rage, and finally a desperate determination that suggested he wasn't ready to concede defeat. "This isn't over," Tyler said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. "You can't fight everyone in this school. You can't watch your back 24 hours a day." Marcus walked over to where Derek was still struggling to regain his footing and offered the larger boy a hand up. Derek stared at the extended hand for a moment, then accepted the assistance with visible confusion. "No hard feelings," Marcus said quietly. "You were just backing up your friend." "I respect that." Derek nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. What did you do to me?" "Pressure point technique," Marcus replied matter-of-factly. "Causes temporary paralysis but no permanent damage. My father taught it to me for self-defense." As Derek walked away, clearly reconsidering his alliance with Tyler's crew, Marcus turned his attention back to the three wrestlers who remained. They stood huddled together like survivors of a natural disaster, their worldview fundamentally shaken by what they'd witnessed. "Here's what's going to happen," Marcus said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You're going to leave me alone. You're going to leave Amy alone. You're going to leave everyone alone. Because if I hear about you terrorizing other students, I'll make what just happened to Derek look like a gentle massage." Tyler opened his mouth to protest, but Marcus continued before he could speak. "I know what you're thinking. You want to escalate this, bring weapons or older kids, or try to catch me off guard somewhere. But before you do that, you should know something about my father." Marcus paused, letting the silence build tension. "Colonel Chun isn't just any military officer. He's Army Special Operations, and he's taught me things that aren't in any high school wrestling manual. What you saw on Friday was me being gentle. What you saw just now was me being merciful. Push me again, and you'll discover what I'm like when I stop caring about your feelings." The threat hung in the air like a physical presence. Tyler, Jake, and Connor exchanged glances, their bravado completely deflated. They'd expected to restore their reputation through superior numbers and intimidation, but instead they'd been outmaneuvered by an opponent who operated on a completely different level. "You're bluffing," Tyler said, but his voice cracked slightly on the words. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed them a photograph. Colonel Chun in full dress uniform, his chest covered with medals and ribbons that told the story of multiple combat deployments and specialized training. The image was intimidating enough, but Marcus's next words sealed their fate. "Call his office if you want confirmation. Ask them about his qualifications for teaching hand-to-hand combat. Ask them what he did in Afghanistan and Iraq. Then ask yourself if you really want to find out what techniques he's passed on to his son." The fight went out of Tyler's crew like air from a punctured balloon. They'd signed up to intimidate a transfer student, not to go to war with someone whose father had been trained to eliminate actual enemies of the United States. The mathematics of the situation were suddenly very clear, and none of them liked the results. Amy appeared at the edge of the dispersing crowd, her face glowing with relief and admiration. As Tyler, Jake, and Connor slunk away toward their cars, she approached Marcus with tears in her eyes. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually did it. They're finished." Marcus nodded, but his expression remained serious. "They're finished. Terrorizing people, but that doesn't mean they're harmless. Keep your guard up for a while, just in case they're stupid enough to try something." As the parking lot emptied and normal after-school activities resumed, Marcus realized that his war with Jefferson Valley High's bullies was finally over. He'd achieved something that previous transfer students had only dreamed of: complete victory without compromise or retreat. The next few weeks passed peacefully, with Tyler's crew maintaining a respectful distance from Marcus and everyone else they'd previously targeted. Derek Santos even nodded respectfully when he passed Marcus in the hallways, their brief confrontation having earned Marcus a reputation that extended far beyond the wrestling team. Tyler himself seemed to have undergone a fundamental personality change. The cool swagger was gone, replaced by a subdued caution that suggested he'd learned hard lessons about the difference between athletic skill and real capability. He still wrestled competitively, but his appetite for terrorizing other students had been permanently cured. For Marcus, Jefferson Valley High became what his father had always hoped it would be: a place where he could focus on education rather than survival. He joined the academic decathlon team, made genuine friends among students who appreciated intelligence over intimidation, and for the first time in years, began to think about the future in terms of opportunities rather than obstacles. The quiet transfer student who'd arrived 3 weeks earlier was gone, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes the only way to find peace was to demonstrate that you were prepared for war. Marcus had learned that running from bullies only delayed confrontations rather than avoiding them, and that standing your ground, even against overwhelming odds, could change everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.